This is VOA's Plugged In Podcast.
Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, and this week we asked the question, is it game over for the terrorist group known as Islamic State? And what should happen to Americans who sided with the enemy? According to U.S. President Donald Trump, ISIS has been defeated. And if you were born on American soil and left the United States to join ISIS, you are no longer welcome back in the United States. But has ISIS really been defeated? What is with the war on terror? What is U.S. intelligence saying? And what do U.S. allies think? We're going to speak to reporters, analysts, and lawmakers to find out what is going on. Plus, we're also going to bring you an update later in the program on the ongoing growing crisis in Venezuela. But first, U.S. President Donald Trump says an Alabama woman who traveled to Syria to join ISIS will not be allowed to come home to the United States. Mr. Trump made that announcement in a recent tweet in which he instructed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo not to allow Hoda Muthana back into the United States. Plugged In's Mil Arcega has more.
Hoda Muthana, now 24, was a college student when she traveled to Syria to join ISIS in 2014. She became an ISIS bride, joining other militants in calling for the death of Americans. Now with an infant child, she's expressed remorse and has asked to return to the United States. Despite having a valid U.S. passport and birth certificate, the State Department claims she was never really a U.S. citizen because her father, they say, was a foreign diplomat when she was born, an argument that's now being challenged in court by her family. If returned to the United States, Muthana is likely to face terrorism charges. A small number of Americans, about 60, are known to have traveled to Syria to join ISIS. Nearly all the American men captured in battle have now been repatriated. But it's unclear why some of the American women and children, at least 13 according to the New York Times, have not been. In Britain, another young woman, 19-year-old Shamina Begum, who left the UK to join Islamic State in 2015, also wants to return home. Begum recently gave birth to a baby boy. She, too, has been denied permission to return to England after the British government revoked her citizenship.
The UK says people like you are potentially very dangerous.
Given the recent spate of ISIS defections, is it safe to assume that membership in the terror group is on the decline? And has ISIS really been defeated? VOA Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch is in Syria near one of the last remaining strongholds for Islamic State fighters.
It appears to be the last days of the Islamic State group's self-proclaimed caliphate. It is now a fight for a cluster of tents with perhaps 1,000 or more people inside. Authorities say they have been stunned by the number of people that have fled this small area, more than 6,000 in the last week alone. Nearly a third are children under 5 years old. Afaf, 13, lost her mother and sister when an airstrike hit her front yard.
I was shocked. I just shouted and called for help. That's it.
But these families are not ordinary victims. Almost all are believed to be related to IS fighters. The women who arrived last night said that all of the men were taken for further screening. And unlike former battles where most people denounced IS, some true believers from Baghouz are quick to deny their caliphate is falling.
All of the people inside Baghouz and those that are outside will find victory. May God grant them a victory.
Meanwhile, attacks continue almost every day. Observers, including aid workers, warn that without major changes, the defeat of IS here may just mark the end of this phase of the extremism that haunts the region.
There's a pattern of religious extremist movements, and this is only the latest. And so I think you have to counter it in two ways. One is you've got to immediately react to any violent action with force, because that's all they respect. But on the other hand, you have to look at some of the root causes, again, of injustice.
Syrian and international forces expect to declare the defeat of IS in the coming days, but it is still unclear if a victory will, in this case, also mean a win. Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Deir ez-Zor, Syria.
As time has marched on, you may have forgotten exactly who and what ISIS is. So here's a quick look at Islamic State by the numbers from Plugged In producer Valikia Newsom.
The Islamic State of Iraq, And the Levant, also known as ISIS or Islamic State, was founded in 1999, originally a splinter group of al-Qaeda. It is led by a man named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, whose stated aim was to establish an Islamic caliphate in the regions surrounding Iraq and Syria. At its peak, Islamic State controlled an area of about 88,000 square kilometers and once held nearly $2 billion in assets. The group, designated a terrorist organization by the United Nations, once held as many as 3,500 people captive. Since 2013, Islamic State has claimed responsibility for as many as 136 attacks, leading to a global coalition of 79 countries committed to stopping it. Despite recent losses in areas it once controlled, Islamic State is estimated to have between 20 to 30,000 members. That's about 17,000 fighters in Iraq and more than 13,000 in Syria. As many as 4,000 near U.S. military areas of operation.
VOA National Security Correspondent Jeff Selden has been covering ISIS for many years. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Those numbers by Heather Murdoch, absolutely staggering. 6,000 people in the last week, and out of the 6,000, a third, about 2,000 under the age of 5 are now leading ISIS. So what do you see as sort of the status of ISIS?
Well, the main concern is how many people are actually still in that small area, a cluster of tents described as maybe several hundred square meters in this village of Baghouz in Syria. Just about a week ago, Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S.-backed forces who are leading the assault, said they expected there were about 300 Islamic State fighters, maybe 1,000 civilians. Since that time, we've had reports that maybe 6,000, 7,000. There were reports of more people fleeing last night in the thousands coming out of this little area. And that gives both the U.S.-backed forces and the coalition great pause because they suspect there is a very sophisticated network of tunnels and caves underneath Baghouz, where there may be an untold number of Islamic State fighters still hiding, still waiting to fight to the death.
Well, I've been in the area myself in Iraq where they've dug these tunnels in these houses. I mean, it's incredible what they do and when they hide. But as ISIS loses this territory for their caliphate, does that necessarily defang them? Because it doesn't take a whole lot to cause trouble.
2 to 3 years ago, military officials in the U.S., intelligence officials would have said yes. If you can destroy the self-declared caliphate, you will break Islamic State's momentum. They won't be as popular. People won't adhere to the ideology because they thought it was really tied to the idea that they had established the caliphate. Now, intelligence and military officials really doubt that. They see that even with the loss of territory in Iraq and Syria, they still have tens of thousands of fighters and followers who are willing to take up the cause. There are sleeper cells that have been active both in Syria and in Iraq. And they have, provinces and they have connections to affiliates all over South Asia, the Middle East, and into the Philippines even. In Afghanistan, they have almost 1,000 fighters. The U.S. has even bombed them there using some of the biggest bombs, non-nuclear bombs, in the U.S. arsenal, and yet the numbers keep coming back. The same in Nigeria, where part of Boko Haram, the terrorist group, pledged allegiance to Islamic State. They thought that their numbers have come back up. They now have 3,000 to 4,000. They also have a presence in Libya, which was pushed back, but now their numbers have rebounded there. And you have people still coming. Afghanistan has reported that there are still people coming from some of the former Soviet republics through Pakistan into Afghanistan to join Islamic State. So even if you destroy the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, which is on the verge of happening right now, military and intelligence officials in the U.S. say the fight is really far from over.
Do you throw into the pool as well al-Shabaab in Somalia? I mean, all these sort of terrorist groups, are they all sort of part of, do we think of all of these as ISIS because they all have the same sort of motive, it seems to be very destructive and to kill?
Well, there was a battle going on in Somalia with al-Shabaab where there was a faction of the group which has pledged itself to al-Qaeda, which is a rival on the international stage to Islamic State. And there was a group that wanted to pledge to Islamic State. They wanted to be more aggressive than al-Shabaab was at the time. And that was brutally put down. Yet Islamic State still has several hundred fighters. It's never lost its presence. So at the same time, there's competition between these two groups. But here's what intelligence officials fear. Because of all the focus that the world has put on Islamic State and the attacks that it's carried out and the way it conquered so much territory, it's given al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups a bit of a breather. They've had a chance to regroup. And in fact, U.S. intelligence officials believe al-Qaeda has strengthened its position, especially in Syria, and is very active in areas where the U.S. has not been, where the U.S. has not been backing forces or running campaigns with bombs and trying to push out these terrorists. So it becomes a very difficult situation. And so there's a new debate now about how do you battle these extremists when bombs and bullets alone, as some lawmakers have said, just won't work.
Well, in your recitation earlier, you talked about the different places in the world where you find these pockets or cells of ISIS. You didn't mention the United States. Does that mean that we don't have these cells in the United States? They haven't come here. They aren't headed here. That the United States need not fear, at least that type of situation, or is it something else?
There are people in the United States who have been convicted of crimes in the name of Islamic State, where they've either tried to get to the Islamic State, where they've tried to secure money for the Islamic State. And generally, U.S. intelligence services, the FBI, have been very good at tracking those people down, often at times arresting them at the airport as they're about to board a flight to try to go to Turkey and then sneak their way to the Islamic State or get to one of the other groups. The interesting dynamic that separates the United States from European countries, where you've also had large numbers of people be interested by the Islamic State propaganda, and in many cases, there are about 8,000 Westerners overall who are believed to have traveled to join the Islamic State. Only about 250 total have tried to or actually joined Islamic State from the U.S. And intelligence officials have found that in the U.S., the boundaries between different groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, ISIS, doesn't exist in the same way. And in some cases, they've tracked people who have gone on to travel to those groups over the years, actually meeting together and talking together, and they just see it, they don't see it as the same type of difference. So there still is that appeal to some in the United States. It's not as strong, and often at times, the people in the United States are not as well connected. They don't have the communities that are propping this up, that have really been hotbeds for extremism because of differences in the culture and the way the U.S. is able to assimilate Muslim populations as opposed to Europe.
Well, it's almost unthinkable. This woman who's over there now who wants to come back to the United States, there's some question whether she's a citizen or not a citizen, which is dependent on whether her father was a diplomat when she was born or not. That's a battle that's probably fought out in the courts. But, the recruitment of some women is it's always been shocking to me that these women will travel, will pick up and travel over there and join ISIS and have children. And now we've got, of course, the problem, like, what do we do with the children?
Well, the children's a big problem, but in terms of recruiting women, Islamic State was very savvy early on, and they actually went after women, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, especially in places where if you were a woman, and let's say you wanted to become a doctor, you became a doctor, you're 20, you're 25, 26 now after you've gotten your degree. Well, in some countries, that's very old, and there was tension because the family said, well, you're too old to marry off, there's no room for you here. They would target those women. They would go after people who had degrees in IT or technical abilities who couldn't find a job, and they would target those. One former extremist that I talked to years ago said it's really dangerous because these extremists, in some cases, are the world's best social workers. They know what to say, when to say it, how to say it, to get people feeling like this is someplace they can belong. And so that brings them in, it draws them in. And it wasn't always the violence. As far as the children, that's a big problem, and it's worried the U.S. intelligence community for several years now, because even in these IDP camps, these displaced person camps all across Syria, where you now have thousands of people, many of them women, many of them children under 5, they've grown up in this environment now, which may have been, obviously you have the battles that were fought, the war, but just one that was violent, that a radical ideology permeated every aspect of life. And they've been indoctrinated just because they were born into it or they were living in it for long enough. How do you de-radicalize these young kids? How do you de-radicalize these teenagers? Iraqi officials and Kurdish officials in Iraq in particular have worried about sleeper cells made out of kids who are 12, 13 when ISIS first rolled in and are now 16, 17. And some of the recent attacks in parts of Iraq, in the area of Kirkuk in particular, have involved these young teenagers who were indoctrinated into the ISIS way of life.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Over the past 2 months, officials in the Trump administration have been at odds over ISIS and U.S. strategy. This became evident on December 19 when President Trump surprised many and tweeted that ISIS has been defeated. Trump also announced that he would start withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. President Trump's troop withdrawal announcement led to the resignation of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. A few weeks later, Vice President Mike Pence reaffirmed the president's claim that ISIS has been defeated, and this statement came just hours after ISIS claimed responsibility for an attack in Syria that killed 14 people, including 4 Americans. Lawmakers on both sides of the political aisle have expressed concern about the president's tweets and statement about Syria.
The hasty and disjointed manner of this announcement demonstrates that the administration is in disarray, and the president's ability to lead internationally is, I think, seriously eroded by this decision and by others. And simply because the president tweets that ISIS has been defeated is not the reality.
So the good news is there's growing bipartisan support to ask the president to reverse course and to have a conditions-based withdrawal. All three of us support the idea of withdrawing from Syria and everywhere else when you can do it safely. It is in our national security interest not to withdraw at this time, in my view.
So, who is right? And is it too soon to pull U.S. troops from Syria? My next guest is Michael O'Hanlon. He is Director of Research on Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institute. And Mr. O'Hanlon is urging Congress to step in to, quote, reduce the dangers to the Republic. Thank you for joining us.
Greta, nice to be with you.
So anyway, I assume that I got you right. That on that quote. So tell me, is that correct? Is that what you're asking for?
I'm in favor of staying in Syria. I like the 2,000 number. I'd like to see it stay where it's been. I think it's the first time we've had anything in Syria that's looked like even a partially successful strategy. We're helping the Kurds retain control of 1/3 of the country, not only keeping ISIS at bay, but also keeping Iran at bay and Assad at bay, and also preventing a Kurdish-Turkish war that could escalate the minute we leave. So I think the presence was working beautifully. 2,000 is not a big number. We should have just stayed at that number, but 400 is a lot better than 0. And so I'm relieved that Senator Graham and others have had the kind of success in walking back the president. And I give Secretary Mattis some credit for his principled resignation, which I have to believe, even though President Trump hasn't said so, caused him some consternation and maybe some second thoughts.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they've sort of been renamed in an effort to sort of a little bit to backtrack for the Trump administration. Now they're calling some of them peacekeepers. Am I correct? And so that we're still maintaining a number of the people there, but almost redesignating them.
I get nervous if we are doing that. I think I have heard that word myself, Greta, although I'm not sure it's an official term. But to the extent that Iran and Syria and Turkey hear us use that word, then it may convey irresoluteness. It may sound like we're just there patrolling in, soft hats, the way sometimes UN forces, when they were less successful in certain operations, were not capable even of defending themselves. And that's the last kind of image or message we want to send. So no, they're not peacekeepers. They are combat advisors, and they are still in a war zone where ISIS is not completely defeated, no matter what the president says. And also Iran's ambitions are certainly not defeated, and we all agree on that.
All right, as at least the territory seems to shrink in Syria of ISIS, what about al-Baghdadi? Any thoughts on whether his power is deteriorating? I assume that he's still alive. There's a $25 million bounty on his head by the United States. But what about him, and what about his power?
It's a tough one, Greta, because we need to adopt a nuanced view on these leaders and their importance in their organization. If we make everything about getting Baghdadi, and we somehow do manage to find him and take him off the battlefield, either kill him or arrest him, there could be a successor pretty soon who maybe winds up even more effective, or there could be several people who vie to be his successor who try to compete with each other by encouraging more violence. That's often what happens with a drug organization or a terrorist organization when you knock off the top guy. On the other hand, Baghdadi is in some way a symbol of ISIS's resilience. And if we do remove him, then we've proven that ISIS is indeed vulnerable in yet one more way. So on balance, I would say we should try to find him and deal with him, but we shouldn't make it a big part of our public messaging or our public emphasis.
As a continuing campaign to destroy ISIS, and even the 79 countries worldwide that are joining in, we have the new burden, or the nuanced burden of having all the children who are born, their parents are members of ISIS, and even the American who wants to return home to the United States, and of course other people want to return home to their countries. Some have, some not. What are your thoughts on how to handle the issue with the children, and even some of these women this American woman who signed up to join ISIS, went over there, and now wants to come back to the United States?
Well, first of all, some of these people who might want to come back are criminals at best, and therefore should be treated severely with a criminal prosecution, and we can handle the issue of their children as we would with the children of other kinds of federal and state prisoners. I'm not saying we always do enough for those children, but we do have mechanisms because there are lots of people in jail in the United States who are parents. And so I would think of it in those terms rather than feel we need to invent the wheel all over again. However, the question of to whom you allow even the right of being tried in an American court and try as an American citizen versus who you don't even allow back in the country and repudiate their citizenship, that's a tougher call. But I agree with my colleague Dan Byman, who's written that we should indeed accept back this woman from I think, Alabama, if I remember correctly. I don't know much about her clearly, but what little I've read suggests that she made a stupid, innocent mistake and may not have blood on her hands personally. And so I think that within the structure of the legal system, we should be willing to give her a fair trial and a sentence that would be appropriate to any crimes we can prove she's committed. All
right, well, we go into phase two as the caliphate territory reduces, and of course the ISIS still has the power to grow and inflict pain around the world. But we've got these internally displaced persons camps, and they become almost permanent. People begin living in these horrible situations forever, which are oftentimes breeding ground for terrorism. Is there something new or some new strategy that the United States should look at to aiding people inside these camps?
Well, the place I think of first when I try to think through that question, Greta, is Jordan. Jordan has probably about 1.4 million Syrian refugees on its territory, and Jordan's own population is only 8 million, so this is a huge burden. About half those people are in camps of the type you mentioned. By the way, some of those camps are better run than others. They're often, in a place like Jordan, the government takes the job pretty seriously, gets at least some international help. We don't give Jordan or other countries enough help, but there are mechanisms to try to have schools in these camps, halfway decent living conditions. It's still not a great existence, as you say, but there are ways to make it more tolerable. But also, the other half of the refugees from Syria inside of Jordan are in communities. They've essentially now just moved. And you can handle the IDP question the same way, people who move from one part of their own country to another.
But you know what, Michael, you raised that moving one part to the others. I've been in Jordan, and one of the problems with the Syrian refugees in Jordan is that a lot of the people, the Jordanians were very generous, but there came a point when a lot of these people in the camp went out into the work community and were undercutting the Jordanians and taking jobs, and suddenly they weren't so happy to be, a lot of them, because their economy is so impacted.
Yeah, which is why the Syrian war was such a tragedy for so much of the region. I mean, the burden of 1.4 million people in a population base of 8 million is extraordinary. And you point out that it just can't be expected to continue at that level. So I'm not suggesting that this is a model that you can apply, for more than 10% of your own population. In other words, when you have 700,000 refugees in communities, another 700,000 in IDP camps, a population base of Jordanians of 8 million, that's too much of a burden to ask any country to bear, partly for the reasons that you mentioned. So we got to find a way to walk back the Syrian war, which is part of why I think we need to stay in the Northeast. You can bring some degree of stability and figure out a mechanism to finally get some kind of a post-war settlement where Assad stays in power for a while, I'm afraid to say, but at least you can begin some limited process in parts of the country of bringing people home.
These are very serious questions. I'm afraid they're going to be dwarfed by our upcoming presidential election when it becomes all our attention focused domestically on politics. But these are obviously important issues. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Greta.
And now to the deteriorating situation in Venezuela, where there have been violent clashes between government and security forces and opposition supporters. For the latest on what is going on in Venezuela, we are joined by Bracio Segovia of VOA's Latin American service. Welcome to the show. And I talked about with Michael the problems of all these displaced persons. You've spoken to the president of Colombia, and they've had to take a lot of the burden from Venezuela. So what's the latest with that?
Thank you for having me, Greta. Well, exactly, that's what's happening. They're having a lot of Venezuelans who are crossing the border. Now they closed all the breaches that are actually the border between Venezuela and Colombia, which means that many of the Venezuelans that cross the border on a daily basis, because that's actually many of them, that's their way to make a living. They transport certain items from one place to another. It's not legal, but they do it, and that's how they can actually survive.
I was down there on the border a couple months ago, and people in Venezuela were crossing the border to get money that was being sent to them from the United States, because if they got the money in Colombia, they got to collect all of it, whereas if they received it in Venezuela from Americans, the Venezuelan government took a huge, I don't know if it was 25, 50% of the money. And so there's even that kind of commerce just to get some money from relatives in the United States.
Exactly. There are three reasons why Venezuelans are crossing the border. The first one is for exactly what you just described. They just go there to pick up the money that family members who are living abroad are sending to them. So they pick them up in Colombia and they bring it back to Venezuela in either Colombian pesos or US dollars. So that's one reason. The second reason is actually just to exchange their currency, right? Because in Venezuela they cannot do that, so they do it in Colombia, which is a neighbor country, and in that way they have more money in Venezuela to survive, where their inflation is huge. It's ridiculous right now. And the third reason is for work purposes, right? It's illegal work most of the times, but they just cross the border. They help people to transport certain things. They sell their hair. There's many kind of illegal jobs that they do.
It is, but this is catastrophic. People are hungry in Venezuela. Families, there's no food on the shelves in grocery stores. You've seen video of people grabbing food from garbage trucks. Maduro and his opposition leader are this horrible feud. The United States has weighed in on part of the opposition leader. Where are we going?
Well, that's actually the $1 million question, right? I don't know. According to my sources, they don't even know where we're going right now. We are talking about a possibility of a military intervention. Colombia is very concerned about that because they just got out of a 50-year conflict, right? So they're really afraid that they're going to get involved in a conflict with a neighbor country. Also, the thing is that the group of Lima, the Lima group, they just met in Bogota this Monday. Surprisingly, the result of that meeting was we are not for a military intervention. Diplomatic efforts should prevail. But the thing is that one day before that meeting, just one day before the meeting, Juan Guaido's people, right, which is the interim president of Venezuela at the moment, they were pushing for a military intervention, mentioning exactly the same words that President Trump was repeating over and over again, which is all options are on the table. Vice President Mike Pence said the same thing even at the meeting. He was actually taking part in that meeting. So surprisingly, the result of that meeting was different. And what my sources are telling me is that most members of the Lima group are against any use of force or military intervention. So that's what pushed them to actually deny any military intervention for the moment. But truth is, we don't know where this is going. And let's keep in mind, the U.S. is not a member of the Lima group. So maybe, just maybe, the U.S. could actually take a unilateral decision to use that military intervention.
We have 30 seconds left. Who are Maduro's allies? Anyone?
Well, Maduro's allies at the moment is Cuba. Also
Bolivia?
Bolivia, Russia, Ecuador.
So we're bringing a huge regional conflict. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it's almost a proxy war in some ways. I mean, there's a lot of competing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Ecuador, like opposition, because there was a shift. The thing is that what we're seeing in the region right now, right, for the last years, is a shift towards the right. So many countries that were led by the left-wing parties, they shifted, right? So there's been a change, and that's actually important to take into account when it comes down to what's going to happen in Venezuela, who are the countries that are actually supporting Maduro, and where this is going.
And, of course, the people are starving meantime and hurting. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. And you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.
Thanks for listening to VOA's